Hi, everyone. My name is Delvin Fletcher. It's my privilege to lead the International Institute of Business Analysis, which is an independent, not-for-profit professional association that seeks to serve the global business analysis community. And it's my privilege to welcome all of you. We have an audience, I think, from all over the world at various time zones, ranging from daytime, evening, in the middle of the night for a few of us. And it's great that you have joined us today. Thank you for that. A couple of housekeeping items just before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the Q&A section in Zoom. And Keith, who's going to be moderating this, Keith Ellis, our Chief Engagement and Growth Officer, will try to deal with a few of them as we have some time as we move into the subject matter that we're dealing with today. Also, today's webinar recording will be available on the IIBA's webinar archive page in the next week or less, so it will certainly be there available as we move forward. Let me get started then with kind of what we're really here to do today. We're very privileged to partner with an IIBA business analysis partner globally, SoftServe, which is a company that was born 29 years ago, as you can see on the slide, in Ukraine. And SoftServe is a global technology company, but has a very large business analysis community internally of more than 500 staff dedicated to business analysis work. So there's a natural connection between the work that they're doing and some of what we at IIBA are trying to do as a professional association. And specifically today, we're coming together with kind of a really interesting group that I don't think has ever met in this fashion before, to really support one very simple thing, which is SoftServe's Open Eyes Foundation, which is a charitable foundation that works in a number of charitable areas, raising funds, connecting donors and worthy projects that was originated in Ukraine a number of years ago. And our goal, and Keith will talk a little bit more about this in a minute, is going to be to just use this setting that we have to talk about change, to talk about the challenges in the space that we work in business analysis, to use that as an opportunity for our community to come together, and where you are able to provide some support to Open Eyes, we would encourage you to do that. And that's really our purpose today. So let me move on to one more slide before I turn things over to Keith. I'm very honored to have the chairs of IIBA's board of directors, essentially from the last decade, with us today. I'm pretty sure this might be the first time this group has ever been together. And it's really my privilege to introduce them to you. So let me just do that before I hand things over to Keith. Keith is going to moderate this session today. Keith is now the Chief Engagement and Growth Officer at IIBA. He was a past chair of IIBA's board. And we are joined, Keith is based in Western Canada. And we are joined by four other past chairs of our board: Michael Agello, who is based in Australia and is joining us in, I think, the middle of the night. Barbara Karkenord, who is the current chair of IIBA's board, who's based in the US, but is currently in Europe. So it's late in the evening for her. Ken Fulmer, who is a former chair of IIBA's board, and also my predecessor as CEO of IIBA, who's based in the United States. And Michele Martato, who is also a past chair of IIBA's board, who is based in Milan, Italy. So it's a great privilege to welcome this group that kind of represents the lineage of IIBA over the last decade, a group of people that have also volunteered immense amounts of their time. And I can say that as someone who's worked with many of them. Being chair of a not-for-profit board is a lot of work, and I really admire the effort and hours and energy that each of these five people have put into that service to our global community over the past 10 years or so. So it's great to have a chance to hear them share some of their thinking and some of their reflections on how business analysis intersects with change in our world today. Obviously, we're just going to touch on this subject. Probably we're not going to develop it all that comprehensively, but thank you for joining us. And with that, let me turn things over to Keith, who's going to moderate our session today. Welcome, Keith.
Thank you. I appreciate such kind words, and thank you, all of you, for joining today in our session, and perhaps more somber conversation than what we've had in the past for our members. Several months ago, as Delvin had talked about, we work with SoftServe. We've been working with many members of our Ukraine community, and we reached out and said, what are some things that we could be doing to assist and to work with your community? and offer some support. And Oksana and the team and Nadia and the team over at SoftServe said, we want to do this event to support the community and work in support of Ukraine. And so I think today is just a wonderful opportunity to reflect and also to ask some difficult questions as we step into the conversation today, really about change, which was the recommendation that the team at SoftServe had suggested. Let's focus in on change and sometimes disruptive to be something that we can field, because it is who we are as a business analysis community, that need to deal with change, and it's so central to everything that we do. So what I wanted to do today is kick off with a question directly from the team at SoftServe, Nadia and Oksana, pushing this one forward to say, okay, by the way, I get to address kind of an auspicious audience here. You know, I get to be the moderator on this one. So all of us have dealt with upper management employees being resistant to change, right? This challenge of being able to kind of break through, get people's attention and move things forward. Let's start with a very direct question, a difficult question. What approaches may help a business analysis professional overcome some of those hurdles and really overcome moving things forward? Who am I going to pick on first here? Let's go to Michele on this one.
Hello, Keith. Thank you very much for this question. And good evening, good morning, and good afternoon to everyone. Let me answer this question. I believe that people do realize that all the world has changed, but still resistance to change exists. My advices for a business analyst are the following. All the executives in the organization are searching for help and support from business analysts. But the help and support that you can give is different when you deal with top manager, with managers, or with employees. So for top managers, I think that business analysts must be strategic business analysts. By strategic business analyst, I mean referring to the Babot guide, what we call strategy analysis. So show them some models of change. Customize those models to their context. Propose them a roadmap. Show them that risks are under control. Speak often with them and help them communicate the change in the organization. One risk that I normally see when I deal with top managers is the fact that during a change, people at top management try to enter a lower level activity. So as business analysts, you should teach them and coach them to stay at their top management level. They have many things to do and they have to stay there. For middle management, make sure that the vision that the top managers have defined is clearly communicated to them. Make sure their feedback is understood and incorporated. Listen to them. Support them in planning, communicating, and controlling the change. They must align their own priorities and their own work with the strategic objectives. Also help them to assess the existing resources and to balance the workload for the resources. During change, normally organizations are quite confused. They try to do many things and they assign the same task to different companies and they overload employees of tasks. So you must help them in organize the work. And finally, for employees, make sure that the vision and the roadmap of change is properly communicated to them. Make sure also their feedback is understood and incorporated. Listen to them to make sure that also their needs are addressed properly. Engage those ambassadors to influence other people. Training on leadership may be important for all resources, top managers, middle managers, and the low employees. But you need to enforce transparencies. Also, change should happen iteratively. Make sure that continuous improvement mechanisms are in place. Many lessons, but I believe that have summarized my thought.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Michele. When we are talking about giving some very specific advice, I think you gave some very concise, you gave some great points in there as we're walking this through. I think I'm going to go over to Michael Agello there, who is now participating at 2 o'clock in the morning. Do you have a few thoughts here that you might use to augment this?
Thank you, Keith, and hello, everyone. I was nodding when Michele was talking, and it'll come as no coincidence, perhaps, that when I was thinking as he was talking that I've been lucky enough in my career to see professional BAs actually demonstrate leadership through facilitating a shared vision and coming to a shared vision of the future, sharing what success looks like, and facilitating shared views of expected outcomes. And as professional BAs, the great BAs ask great questions. And as Michele said, if we listen to our management and employees, our colleagues who are resistant to change, we can get an understanding of their perspective, as he says. And if we truly listen and truly make an effort to understand, we can actually demonstrate empathy and work together and define a transition to an agreed future state. So that's always worked for me in my various roles. And as Michele said, based on mutual respect, transparency is a key, and a shared understanding of what success looks like.
It's a great answer, Michael. I really appreciate that one. And I think we have to make sure we start moving around the wheel here of people who are on my screen. So Barbara, I think you're going to be up next for this particular one. Why don't we talk about how the business analysis professional can really position themselves to enable change? I know, Michele, you talked about it extensively in your answer, how the business analysis professional needs to position for that change. Why don't we come over to you, Barbara, and really, talk to that positioning themselves to enable change?
Sure, Keith, thanks. Happy to be here. Thank you all for joining us today. Michele did give us a great list of the kinds of things that BAs know how to do well. And I love the fact that he kept mentioning communication, because that's a key. As I think about this question, how can we position ourselves? I would encourage BAs to make sure that they take the blinders off. And what I mean by that, if you think about a horse and carriage, and oftentimes the horse has those blinders on so that they only see straight ahead. But as BAs, we should be keeping our eyes open to everything that's around us. I think we should be paying attention to the news. We should be reading articles about our industry. We should be reading about other industry disruptions. Stay on top of, from a strategic perspective, what's going on in the world. To tie into what Michele and Michael were saying, is when you're talking to an executive, that's what they're going to be interested in, is what's going on in the world and how is it going to impact us. So being prepared to have those conversations, and attending webinars on topics that you don't know anything about, being aware of any issues in your industry. I want to say, keep learning, and I know Ken is going to want to talk about that, because that's a very important part to him. But keep learning new techniques, keep learning new concepts, making yourself as aware as you can of all the possible changes that might be coming will better position you to be able to react to them.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Just kind of walking through, what people can do on the positioning here. Why don't we come around to Ken? We haven't heard from you yet. Can you?
Yeah, hi, Keith.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My pleasure to be here. It's a great cause and great conference topic. Yeah, as Barbara alluded, one of the things that I'll talk about is that lifetime learning that is so important to all BAs, and it gives us the ability to understand how to frame the changes in the world when we're communicating. But I think, in a practical matter, I gave it some thought and thought it really depends on context of where you're operating in an organization. If you're on a project and kind of a junior person or a contractor into a project, your ability to influence tends to be restricted to the project scope. And there's a lot of things you can do to influence change at the project level. and drive out the intended change that the organization wanted to accomplish, achieving the right business objective. And it is communication, and I'd extend Michele's point of it's communicating to a really broad audience. One classic example I'm going to bring to you from my experience while I was the chief technology officer at Sunoco. I was asked by the chairman of Sunoco to go out and visit another company on which he was a board member, and the company had implemented SAP, and the implementation turned out to be not a very good one. And they're in the candy business, and it was getting to be September, October, which in the United States is a major candy time. It goes from the fall and through Valentine's Day is the major stroke of candy business. Anyway, I went out to consult with them and find out how liable the board members were going to be over this failure, because it was teetering them on the brink of bankruptcy at the time because they couldn't ship product. And I looked at the details of it and interviewed all the key players, the consultants that implemented it, the SAP team, the onboard people, and the bottom line of it was about a communication failure. The issue was the change was brought out to the people who were very directly involved, but one group they missed, and that was the distributed warehouses. And it turned out the issue was no one communicated. They had changed the product codes and the shipping codes for the warehouse. And so they were ordering lots of product to come to the warehouse, and it was overflowing the warehouse to where they had to rent commercial space. But the delivery instructions and the code for outbound shipments were messed up, so product wasn't leaving the warehouse. And that communication failure, that lack of ability of the people that were trying to reach out to that one relatively small asset, they were focused on the marketing people and the manufacturing people and the finance people and all the people that were more involved in that project. But the failure to communicate it and to enable the change, and the change to be understood by the operators in the field, brought the project to almost a catastrophic end. They didn't have to fix anything in SAP. They didn't have to make any systems changes. It was all about improving the communication, and it righted itself, and the project was successful with a crash effort to fix that communication problem. So I thought that's instructive about seeing where there are those missing communication issues and acting on them. See something, say something. Important motto for BAs too.
That's a great answer. And I thought, Ken, why don't we stick with you for just a second, because you were talking really in a project context there. You're talking about business analysis and some of those more traditional. But we have a lot of world events that are happening, and there's this rising importance to strategy analysis. And I think there's an even bigger role in there that the business analysis professional can play, and leading that change from maybe a different position and a different context. Can I get your thoughts on that one? And I want to, come over to Curly's question on soft skills, and maybe I'll forward that to Barbara afterwards. But continue your thoughts here, Ken, but just maybe from an out of project context, more from a strategy analysis context.
Yeah, strategy analysis, especially in this day and age, with so many things impacting more so than they have in the past. I mean, pandemic was a terrible impact to business, and caused us to pivot in so many areas so quickly. And then of course the war in Ukraine itself has disrupted supply chains, and pandemic impacted demand. There's inflation going on a global basis. So there are a lot of very macro level changes that are impacting business strategy. And so the question becomes, what do we do if you're more a senior management consultant style BA that's working at more senior levels with the leaders in an organization? How do you create a strategic response that is appropriate to the times. And I think a lot of it is, going back to the fundamentals of looking at where to go and what to do next in response to the emergency. I mean, my own personal experience, again, going back to Sunoco, we had a major disruptor with 9/11, the attack on the World Trade Center. And certainly at Sunoco, it was a huge, huge disruptor. We had to take the whole organization and pivot on responding to that event. We're physically close to it. We weren't directly involved, but our executives really had an emotional impact of watching pieces of paper blow down Wall Street and thinking that, that's the business, that's our records, that's everything about the company and everything we do. And so we had to respond to that, and it drove a vast acceleration of digital. I think we saw that same effect with the pandemic, of people enabling for their employees to work at home and to enable their processes and customers become more digital and interact, not so much at a walk-in retail environment or with that responsibility. I think it's, Keith, you and I know from firsthand, it changed the way we did sales and marketing. And fortunately, IIBA was a little bit on top of that at the time, thanks to your effort to guide us to a more digital approach to sales and marketing. But the whole world had to adapt to that in the face of the pandemic. Yeah. And now other supply chain problems are creeping in to say, what looked like a brilliant strategy of just-in-time inventory management now looks like a foolish proposition, because the supply chains are weak, they're not smooth and operational, and problems are there. So the ability to go in and put together rapid responses to building strategy, and BAs have a whole set of tools available. I mean, my favorite one that I always use was the tool that allows us to go forward and take a look at the business model canvas and drive. The beauty of it is it follows a philosophy I really appreciate, and that is customer first. Yeah. Look at how the impact is strategically to the customer, then work your way back through suppliers, through partners, and through the employees, and develop a response that's appropriate to the changes and dynamics that are going on outside of the company, let alone the business changes at a strategic level inside a company. So
it's great, Ken. I appreciate that. I think, like you're touching on so many issues in terms of the strategy analysis layer and how that comes back in. And I want to continue that thread, and Mikhail, I think I'm going to come over to you in a minute, but I want to take 1 minute to pick up a question from the audience. And that's Curly had asked a question around soft skills. Barbara, I think I'm going to jump over to you on this one, because you've spent so much of your life running a training organization.
Sure, Keith. And thanks for the question, Curly. What soft skills would be necessary to develop to deal with organizational changes as BA? I think to me, one of the biggest ones is to have, obviously we've been talking about good communication, but to have positive communications. I think that there are a lot of people, and most of us as BAs, we kind of like change. I mean, that's what drew us to this field, was we like to enable change. We like to improve our organizations, but most people don't like change and they're afraid of change. And so we can make people more comfortable by being positive in the way that we talk about change, and not to be, overly phony positive, to be honest about, this might be difficult, things are going to change, but look at what the opportunities are, and to keep that positive attitude, helping people work through the change and see that something better might come out on the other side. The pandemic was horrible for so many people. And at the same time, some people really came out of it with a positive experience in terms of, job roles that people have now and their recognition of how they would like to work and how they best can work. And so to always try to keep, a positive but honest attitude as you're supporting other people through the change and recognizing how much they may not like it. You know, we kind of thrive on it, but most people do not.
I'm going to break out a little bit because you talked about the pandemic quite a bit. And, you know, we've got a great question from Philippe, who is asking, the pandemic has shown big and fast changes possible. Now, I'm going to pick on Delvin because he's sitting in the center of the screen here. And we haven't heard from him yet. But Delvin, you lived it as the CEO. And it was one of our first conversations was, okay, we had all these other plans. We now have something that's emergent. It's going to potentially be catastrophic. What are you going to do? So my feeling on this one is maybe you'd be very well suited to answer. What can we learn from the pandemic to improve our and our organization's readiness and ability to change? Let's build on what Barbara was talking about there before we come back over to Michele.
Thanks, Keith. I think there's been a lot of learning, and I'm going to rely certainly on some of the people that I have learned from in a couple of areas. I think some of the themes that we've talked about are very relevant to Philippe's question, which is a lot of people, if you read the literature, particularly from some of the eminent consulting firms and some of the other thought leaders, think about the pandemic as an accelerant to change. In other words, it wasn't so much that it originated new creativity, so to speak. It took a lot of things that were going on in the world and made them either imperative or fast or faster or needed to come faster. And I think what's interesting about that is you could argue that that's the way we should always be thinking. We should always be thinking in terms of that sort of agility in the back of our minds around what could change. Because to the point that I think Ken and Michele were talking about earlier, if we are really focused on our customers, then that also means we have to be tuned in a little bit to how they are changing. And in a lot of organizations, that happens a lot, happens frequently. Sometimes it happens catastrophically, to the point that Ken was making a little bit earlier in his example. And I think one of the things that we did inside our small organization at IIBA is we deliberately started very early on in the pandemic a change to our cadence around communication. We actually talked internally a lot about empathy, because we were a virtual organization and we were now engaging with organizations that were, for the most part, transitioning from physical to virtual, and we're learning a whole lot of things that we were actually a little bit comfortable with because it had kind of been the way we'd already operated. So we had to build some really good skills in that area to adjust to it. But I think there's also a bigger, maybe strategic issue around Philippe's comment, which is the pandemic showed the brittleness in a lot of organizational strategies. And by that, I mean that, you know, the one example we already talked about is if you engineer a supply chain only on the basis of its cost equation, and you don't engineer it for, you know, the risk of geopolitical issues or the risk of a container ship going sideways in the Panama Canal, or the risk of other kinds of factors that could actually influence it. If your driving force has only been a single dimension of business strategy, then things like pandemics will actually challenge that thinking in a really, really big way. You know, probably the best analogy I can use has nothing to do with pandemics is this idea of thinking and building flexibility into how we operate. And maybe this will kind of help reinforce my point before I turn it back to you, Keith. I live in Toronto, Canada. Toronto has this big tower called the CN Tower, which is one of the tallest freestanding structures in the world. It's a tourist attraction, and many of you will probably have seen it or maybe have been up on it. That thing, I think, if I remember correctly, is around 1,500 feet tall. It was very iconic when it was built. I read a little bit about the engineering of it once, and it is designed to move 6 feet off axis at its top in a hurricane force wind. And of course, you're not going to be up there in a hurricane force wind. And that thing's made of concrete. It's basically a 1,500-foot tower made of concrete that is designed with a very intentionally engineered piece of flexibility in it, because if it didn't, there would be a catastrophic thing that would ultimately happen to it, right? And I think that metaphor, that principle is really maybe one of my biggest learnings coming out of this pandemic, which is plan well, execute well, document, analyze, do everything to the best of your ability, but don't bring things into such a level of tightness, such a level of precision, such a level of definition that you are kind of so committed to that you have no capacity to step back from that when something happens that is changing the paradigm that you thought was your normal a week ago or a month ago or a year ago. And I think if there's one lesson that I've taken out of it, it's that one. Thanks, Keith.
Great answer. Well, we needed to make sure you're involved in the conversation there, Delvin. You're right in the center of my screen. So I want to bring it back to one of Michele's passions. I know he's passionate about strategy analysis. Fabricio has asked the question, what situation should we be generating change instead of responding to change? And I thought, what a great segue to bring it back over to Michele, one of his favorite topics, talking about strategy analysis and the role of the business analysis strategist to understand and lead change from a high level. Can I bring that back over to you, Michele, and maybe address that question?
Okay, Keith, thank you. Yes, I totally agree that these broad changes have increased the role and importance of strategic business analyst. As a strategic BA, as I said before, we should support our clients, and I call them clients, again, can be top, middle management or employees, in understanding the change in the context and what problems and opportunity will originate from this change. You might think that a broad change can originate problems and opportunity for decades. I'm talking with other business analysts around the world, talking about the pandemic. You know, some people are still get the COVID, and they say this pandemic will stay with us maybe for decades. And what the impact and changes, we don't even know now. So we need to survive with these problems and opportunities that will live with us for a long time. Then we need to help them to understand this change and to help them model a strategic BA, the future state of the new organization. Where do I want to go? And what are the values that we need to protect in this trip, in this journey? And also supporting them in defining a change strategy. Support them to prioritize and plan the change. Support them in communicating the change and making right decisions. You know, sometimes people watch to us and they have many questions for us. They expect direction. They expect support in making the right decision. As I said before, training in leadership is important because if something is I learned in this broad changes, the fact that we need to increase our competencies in leadership. And also this change should happen iteratively. Make sure that transparency is in place and continuous improvement mechanisms are in place. Also because what is expected in 6 months' time, nobody knows. You have to do something. You have to try something, see what happened, and then adjust your model. Keep adjusting and changing your model. That's my view, Kit.
That's fantastic. I appreciate that, Michele. You know, you've got so much insight in the areas around, you know, there's some investments in training. You've got to be able to iterate. You've got to have good methods and practices supporting the whole organization. And I want to pick up on two themes, you know, the ones that you just talked to, Michele, and a little bit of what Delvin was talking to. And I'm going to pick on Barbara with this one. Okay, so let's kind of walk through on this one, because there are all kinds of disruptions to organization, right? So whether it's M&A or legislation, the luggage crisis, you know, what's going on with the airlines, it's just insane, right? So there's a fuel crisis going on now. There's lots and lots. M&A, you know, that's a big one, right? That many have gone through, and many of us have lived through that and know how disruptive that is, right? Why don't we take a little bit of the theme from where Michele was going and talk a little bit more, rather than the individual level, talk to the organization level. How can organizations be proactive in preparing for future disruptions? How can the organization be proactive in preparing there? Michael's smiling. He wants to answer this one. He gets it next, okay?
All right. I like Delvin's flexibility as we're designing solutions to think about other possible scenarios and not be tied to the current focus. I also think that the world is changing, and we've been talking about businesses, and we think a lot about for-profit, but even for-profit organizations need to be much more sensitive to how their work is impacting the environment and social changes that are going on, governmental changes. It's a much wider world that we need to consider. And you see it happening in many organizations. We all have been directors on the IIBA board, and many boards are trying to diversify and have more conscious thinking about how the environmental impacts, are either negatively or positively being impacted by our company's work. So having a broader perspective, I think, is really important. And the other thing is, I think somebody mentioned, I think McKelly mentioned risks. I think facing risks honestly. If I was running a video rental company like Blockbuster in the United States a few years ago, and I didn't look up and say, wow, streaming is coming, shame on me for not paying attention, right? So I think we need to be open and honest about things are going to change, and at some point our industry or our company is going to face a disruption. And if we just expect it, I think we will be more prepared for it. At some point we're going to merge or we're going to be acquired. And instead of thinking, I think, I started my career at General Motors, and we called people lifers. There were people that, planned on spending their whole lives on the same job, working in the same place, doing the same thing. And they were shocked when, for example, Japanese auto companies were bringing in much higher quality cars than we were producing. And it was a huge disruption. But that's, you can't be that naive. You can't keep your head in the sand. I think the whole organization has to be constantly facing the fact that we're going to have to keep evolving. And the more that we talk about it and think about it and be aware of it, the more ready, we'll be to face it. I know Michael is anxious to add on to that.
I know he does. Now, before we come to you though, Michael, I got to remind people that on screen are 3 ways that you could be donating. Use your phone, use your cell phone. That's why we want to set it up this way. And you can use the QR code to navigate to those places. And clearly, we're all here in support of our community in the Ukraine. So just, use those QR codes as you feel is appropriate. But let me come over to Michael. And you were smiling earlier, that's the reason why I got to come over in your direction there, Michael, to really talk about how do you think organizations can, I know you're going to have opinions on this, organizations can be proactive in preparing for the future.
Well, I was smiling for at least 2 reasons. One is I wish I had a crystal ball and to look into the future and predict what's going to happen. But I think everyone's touched on, the moderation of this, Keith, is working beautifully. These questions flow into each other and they're all overlapping. To summarise what perhaps Barb was saying and others were saying is there's a boring thing that I've got 3 points I think I want to make. The first one is that there's a boring technique in the body of knowledge called risk analysis and management. And many of us who just want to get on and solve problems tend to sometimes forget about risk analysis and management. And it's so important. And those of us who have served on the IIBA's board, risk analysis and risk management is so important. Identifying risks and the management and the mitigations. Scenario planning. And then the second point I think is really important is building an organisation and capability to be prepared for the unknown and being prepared for some of these scenarios that the organisation has identified in the risks. And so it's planning and rehearsing for disruption, identifying people, roles and processes, and get the organisation, build some capability. I'm sure Ken Fulmer's been part of in his oil company. They would have done a lot of scenario planning and building capability, organizational capability. So that's the second point. And the third point, I think and I'm talking about being proactive here. is investing in our people, investing in yourself. BAs on the call who are listening in, the best thing you can do is invest in yourself. Build your own capability up. Build your competencies. Build your confidence in yourself and trust in each other by investing in yourself. Sometimes we wait for our organizations to invest in us. How about you invest in yourself? And then that builds confidence in yourself, confidence in your colleagues, confidence in the process and the teams around you, and that builds resilience. And go figure, when you've got the confidence and the resilience, bring on any change. We are ready. And what change? Who would have predicted the pandemic? Some people did, but if you've got confidence in your ability, strength in your and trust in each other, confidence in the process, you're way more resilient and you can cope with any sorts of change.
I think you're building up a couple of themes here because as you say, you hear them again and again, to these ideas of investing in yourself that Michaela had touched on strongly. Michael, you touched on that. Barbara touched on that. You need those skills to invest and discuss in the moment. You need to not be brittle in your thinking. You need to be contextual, be able to really think through some of these risks. You'd raised that one, Michael, and Delvin had raised that one. Michaela had talked extensively in some of those areas. I was thinking, let's pick up another question from SoftServe, who likes to ask the challenging ones here. In a moment of unprecedented or catastrophic change, you've got this unpredictable set of circumstances and no idea what is going to happen. Delvin and I lived through this a little bit around COVID, but what we're talking about here is quite a bit different than that. So you need to secure your business or your projects from suffering from a larger consequence. That's the kind of scenario that we're looking at. Why don't I turn a very difficult question over to you, Ken, and your vast experience in some of this. You've got to secure your business or your projects from suffering this larger consequence. What would be maybe 3 key steps or decisions you would take for the business analysis or business owners, managers, when you're faced with this type of situation?
Thanks for the question, Keith. I think, I have dealt with that several times in my career of catastrophic events, both internal and external ones. And I think the hardest part for everyone is to, when you're on a project, is to recognize your project's value may not be the same after that event. You may have to stop it and end it. And so coming to grips with that assessment, I think in terms of an action plan, the first thing an organization has to do is deal with the crisis right then and there. Like, that has to be the top priority. All the best minds need to get together in a situation room type environment and figure out what exactly they're going to do to respond to it, whether that's a litigation challenge or a building falling down or a refinery exploding, or a pandemic or a war, all those kinds of tragedies that can occur. First step is figure out an immediate response. I think in terms of the nature of the question that was asked around what to do about the work at hand that's ongoing, I think each project has to assess, if you're 90% done, does it make sense to just try and get it wrapped up? Does it make sense that you're halfway through and the value proposition is not there anymore, so you have to do a benefits assessment and see if you're still a viable project and be prepared to kill it, which is the hardest thing for people on a team to do. But that may be necessary for the organization. I think the second step is go back, especially at the organizational level, and relook not just at the go no go decisions, but the funding levels that are applied. Are the priorities right, and is the funding matching the priorities of the new situation now in alignment? So it's an exercise with your portfolio that has to occur at an organizational level. Is everything it's the capital spending and the development resources and the activities, the major spend activities, are they still appropriate?
Yeah.
And then I think, getting from a strategy level, a portfolio level, to realigning the execution level. It's easy to talk about switching strategy and being agile, but then trying to drive that into execution is another whole problem. And I think that strategy to execution that Michael Agello and I and others in the organization had worked on for several years certainly rings true in these catastrophic situations. So,
yeah, I think that's great advice, Ken. The idea of you can't be so married to the past and your present that you're not seeing what's in front of you. You're not seeing this massive thing that's in front of you, and the need to stop and say it's responsible to evaluate and just ask the question, has this situation changed? Now, you've answered wonderfully and given us 3 or 4 ideas from an organizational perspective. And Michele, I know you in that strategy perspective. Maybe you could take it down to the other part of that question, which is more individual, that business analysis professional and what they could or should be doing. Because I think it ties a little bit into some of what Niani is asking, which is, how can business analysis professionals position themselves to become strategy analysts? These 2 questions kind of tie them a little bit. How should the business analysis professional potentially be reacting in this face of the catastrophic shift? What are your thoughts?
Well, I'm thinking at what happened with the pandemic when all companies in the world 2 years ago were locked down in 24 hours. And many companies had projects running, executing, and employees immediately overnight, they discovered they cannot talk, see each other anymore, interact anymore. So what is my suggestion? What we lived in this situation? First of all, as an individual, you must ensure that your priorities are properly set, are properly defined with the organization priority, and you properly have understood them. So make sure you understand your priorities, what are, okay? Make sure also these are communicated to you. Then as an employee, now you are quite isolated in your own space, then you must understand that you must increase your communication. So you must find a way to speak more often with your colleagues, with your managers. The more you speak with them, the better it is, because it will keep you aligned with the rest of the organization. That means that the organization must ensure that they have in place the proper technologies in place to allow that. Then another aspect is the fact that if you're a manager, you must understand that you must move from a mindset that is typically planning and control to a servant leadership mindset. Is not the team that work for you, it is you that work for your people. So this is a shift in a mindset that manager must happen. And for employees, you must make sure that you are properly empowered to make decisions. That's my opinion, my individual perspective of this change. I think that I captured the 3 biggest points for me.
Yeah, mindset, and I think so many things that you're touching on there, Michele, are very much in line with what other members have said. But I think this mindset and just being there and embracing of it is a new piece that you've really brought out and pinned down. I think it's so important. What I want to do is make sure that we have enough time to wrap up on our day, because I want to bring it back to Dalvin and Nadia, Oksana. But I want to wrap up and go around the table and maybe start with Michael Agello and just ask one simple question, which is, we all have views on how the business analysis professional, no matter what our title, can drive better business outcomes. That's really one of the things that we're talking about at the heart and soul of what we're dealing with today, enabling change and deriving, no matter what that situation, what's that better business outcome. I want to just do a very fast roundtable. one thought each. Michael, Agello, over to you. What's one thought from your perspective on how we can drive better business outcomes?
Well, the professional business BA, the professional BA is well positioned, as we know. You just have to look at the body of knowledge with the underlying competencies in there. And as we said earlier, develop your underlying and be very proactive to develop your underlying competencies and use the guide to drive, you know, some of those tasks. And we heard about prioritization. So if we prioritize the essential items we should be working on at an individual level, as a group level, an organizational level, combined with those underlying competencies, and we put a box around all those bullet points we've been talking about, all the points that all my colleagues have been talking about, and Fabrizio and Philip on the call on the chat, really good points. If you put a box around them all, I'm suggesting it's time we all started demonstrating strong leadership. We don't need to manage many teams or anything like that, or hundreds of people. Just demonstrate leadership. And in Fabrizio's question, then we can start looking for opportunities and we can initiate the change and not respond to change. So let's be courageous and let's lead.
Yeah. Barb, I'm going to come to you. Now, remember, we've got maybe 2 minutes left between everybody else at the table. What's your one thought?
I can't show you my notes here, but I just, Michael and I are in simpatico. I just wrote down, be brave.
Yeah.
This is a time when BAs have some really great instincts. They have some really great ideas. And someone noted, Elizabeth noted, you know, some BAs are shy. You really just have to push yourself a little bit to step up and say some of the things that you're thinking in a polite, respectful way, but go ahead and try to get people to sort of see things from an analytical perspective, and it will pay off.
Yeah. Let's come to Michele before we finish with Ken. Can you give us one thought just to wrap up? We want to leave a little bit of time for Oksana and Nadia.
Yes, my final thought is the following, Keith. BAs are change enablers. This is how we define ourselves in the Bubble Guide. And I would like to see the BAs as the guardians of change. For this happens positively for the organization and safely for all the people impacted by the change.
I think that's fantastic. I really like that one. Ken, can I come to you?
Absolutely. I wanted to leverage something that Delvin mentioned that really caught my ear, and is around being multi-dimensional in the way we do our analysis. That it isn't, we need the economic impact statements and we need that as a dimension, but we can't allow that to be the dominant one. There's the whole ESG element to be applied and other elements that are situational, that I think just getting ourselves to be more multidimensional and less simplistic in the way we do the analysis will enable us to be better leaders.
That's a great thought, Ken. And I want to build on what you've talked about there. It's this idea of truly and deeply understanding value. If that would be my one thing in there, it would be understand and truly understand value from a business perspective. Because I think enabling change, in fact, leading has always been more about truly understanding and deeply understanding what's valued and valuable to the business. And that's the heart of, I think, where we're coming from as a profession. I'm not quoting the Babcock Guide as elegantly as Michele just did, but you know, I gotta work to that. So Delvin, I want to turn it over to you just to wrap up our session here, just as you brought us in, and maybe we can give Oksana and Nadia a little bit of a moment to talk through, but why don't I turn it back over to you? And thank you everybody for participating today. It is just wonderful to see all of you again, even though we're not all in the same room at this point. Delvin?
Thanks, Keith. Thanks, Ken, Michele, Michael, Barbara. Really appreciate your insights that you have taken the time to share with us today. And I don't really have anything else that I want to add, other than it's my privilege to introduce Nadia Trub, who leads SoftServe's Business Analysis Office in Lviv. And I'd just like to turn over the proverbial microphone to Nadia for the last few minutes of our session today to wrap up.
Thank you, Delvin. Thank you for this opportunity. Thanks to all of you for joining our panel discussion. And let me dedicate next few minutes to my country. As you know, Ukraine is the biggest state in Europe. Its size reaches 604,000 square kilometers. As of today, 20.7% of our territory is occupied or annexed by Russian Federation. By June of the current year, Russian-Ukrainian front line has reached 2,450 kilometers. This is twice as much as distance between Washington and Quebec. Those are just data, numbers. But real people are living behind this data. Millions of Ukrainians, children and adults, civilians and defenders. Unfortunately, no analysis is helpful in this case of hardship. Neither business analysis, nor data, or system analysis can solve this riddle. Because this war doesn't have any rules, any predictable decisions, or anything logical we all got used to work with. The only thing each and every Ukrainian can do is to fight on her or his own front line and stand together as a nation. Because we fight not only for our freedom, our dignity and peace, we are fighting for democratic values of the entire humanity. On behalf of SoftServe, global company with Ukrainian origin, let me express my sincerest gratitude to IIBA and all of you, global BA community, for your really invaluable support. Thank you all for staying shoulder by shoulder with us. Glory to Ukraine, glory to our heroes. Thank you.